So thanks, Liz. I'm actually probably going to be a bit harsher than, where did Sunil go? He left. But that was a bit of a downer in a lot of ways. Years ago, I actually used to work with Sunil. So I want to thank Liz, and I want to thank IROC. And I also want to thank all of you, actually, for staying, because we've seen some people leave, but thanks for being here. So I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so about low and moderate income Canadians and how they fare in retirement security and why innovation is actually necessary in Canada to address their needs. So I want to start by giving you a brief overview actually on some of our programs in Canada. I think many of you here, in fact, are extremely familiar with those programs. But the best place to get a measure of how well Canadians are actually doing in retirement security is to look at our program. So on the left, you'll see what actually is a reasonably good news story about declining rates of seniors' poverty. On the right, you'll see part of the reason for that decline. And our benefit system in Canada is made up of a few different things. Old age security, so it's a monthly social security payment available to most Canadians 65 and older, with individual income of less than $114,000. And the maximum monthly payment is $583 a month. Most people earning less than $100,000 receive full OAS in Canada. Next, we have the Guaranteed Income Supplement. The second program is actually designed for seniors without much in the way of income. And the last is the Canada Pension Plan, which was more recently enhanced, but unfortunately that enhancement does not do much for low and moderate income Canadians. So, well, it's true that you see on the left that the benefits have been pretty successful in creating a minimum standard that keeps most seniors out of the technical definition of poverty. The minimum standard is actually not all that high. So we see about $22,000 for income for a single worker earning, say, $50,000 or less. And that level of income on its own really does not give seniors the kind of lives that I think we would say are all that acceptable. So if we want to rise to a level which we think is acceptable, we would turn to private savings. The problem actually is that private savings are not that hot in Canada. So you'll see in this study that the Broadbent Institute did, done I think largely by Richard Shillington a couple of years ago now, the median retirement assets of families age 55 to 64 earning less than $25,000 a year without a workplace retirement plan is about zero. And so that's, I mean, effectively, whether it's 250 or zero, let's call it zero. Which is really not that great. So the Canadians are effectively reliant on government programs. I mean, the conclusion is for about 100% of their income when they stop working. The product that we've designed is a product that is a more effective way for modest earners to build retirement security. But before I talk about that innovation, I want to talk about a couple things that are, let's say, somewhat unique to Canada and in some ways not in a great way. So this is a slide about our mutual fund fees. So I'll cut to the conclusion of this. Maybe the conclusion's a bit obvious here. What's that?
So much for the uplifting part of the day.
Yeah, no, it's not that great. So Morningstar did a survey a couple of years ago, and they gave us a D-. That's not a fantastic grade. We were last among 25 countries surveyed. So our average mutual fund fees in Canada are 2.2%. So the net result of all that is that any savings invested with this level of fees, and you'll see that on the right, effectively results in a loss of about 40% of someone's nest egg. So why are our fees so high? Now, I would say in Canada we have, unfortunately, not a whole lot of competition in our financial services sector, and we also don't really have a whole lot of consumer protection regulation either. That combination, I think, is not fantastic for fees, as you can see. And so that is what it is. The fact of the matter is that fees actually for financial products for lower income Canadians are actually probably even higher than the 2.2% because they often get products through pretty high cost retail channels. So now the next problem is this problem. There's a problem that John Stapleton is extremely familiar with. Get him to look up, which is the GIS clawback. And so, while we're pretty good at setting a floor with the programs that I talked about in the beginning, we have a system that effectively takes away 50 cents on every dollar for lower income Canadians in retirement. So if you had, let's say, $50,000 in an RSP, you would lose $25,000 of that to the GIS clawback. So, there's an example of a worthwhile program effectively being pretty regressive, and that is not great. When you think about when you do the math, as we've done, you find that a low and moderate income Canadian, even if they were saving diligently in an RSP, will wind up with about 75 cents on the dollar back 30 years later in Canada. That number effectively comes through a combination of the GIS clawback and high fees. So that is not terrific. So the question then is in part here, how widespread is this problem in Canada? This problem in Canada is incredibly widespread. When you look across effectively the major regulatory categories, you see, and we've done this according to kind of, I'm going to put in here governance and fiduciary advantage, low costs, and GIS benefit optimization. So in an RSP, what I mean by fiduciary advantage here is that you have governance, and governance effectively that protects people within a product. There is no fiduciary responsibility to, let's say, members, consumers in an RSP typically. The PRPP, which is a more recent regulatory category the Department of Finance created, has a bit better, I'd say, arrangement in terms of governance to some extent. There's more mandated pieces of it. The problem is that the costs are actually very high in the GIS in the way it's been introduced in the market, and the GIS benefit or optimization issue is also not dealt with. A pension plan, even a traditional kind of pension plan, you think about a defined benefit pension plan, you may think that would be terrific for a lower or moderate income Canadian. It actually is not terrific in a lot of ways because of the GIS clawback. So you could wind up with lower fees, but you still effectively have this 50 cent on the dollar problem. The TFSA, while it was actually interestingly introduced in part, and John will know quite a lot about this because he was an important part of that advocacy several years ago, it was actually intended for this purpose in part, which is to allow lower and moderate income Canadians to save efficiently in retirement. It has not been used largely for that purpose by our financial services industry. And so that brings us effectively to My65 Plus, which is the product that we created for SEIU, which is a healthcare union here in Canada. My65 Plus does in fact benefit from those things because it has actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, it has a governance where there is actually a fiduciary duty to the member. It has lower cost fees in terms of the investment product at about 10% of the cost of a typical mutual fund in Canada, and it also would exempt members and does exempt members from the GIS clawback. So another thing that I want to talk about is the conventional wisdom on the willingness to, or ability of lower and moderate income Canadians to save. The conventional wisdom, I would say, goes as follows. Lower and moderate income Canadians don't want to save, they can't save, replacement rates are totally fine, I don't know what the problem is. The fact of the matter is that is, I would say, not true. The work that we did with SEIU in the focus groups, in the interactions we've had with members, are that members are very interested in sacrificing, that they have very high anxiety about their retirement, and there is absolutely a willingness and a desire to save for retirement as a result of that. There is also, I'd say, more broadly based evidence. So that recent report that's noted on this slide from 2017 is that majority of folks in this category would in fact be willing to contribute 10% of their pay. And the Vanguard data is actually quite interesting, which is that over the last 10 years in the United States, and Vanguard is actually a very large, second largest asset manager in the world. They have a lot of folks that are on their platform. Their participation rates among this group have been going up in the last decade. So like I say, it's actually in some ways quite important to understand that the myths, which are in fact myths, and I would say that before I got into this line of work, I was never challenged in conventional wisdom. I assumed that the replacement rate numbers that people would throw around were perfectly acceptable. That makes sense. The math makes sense. But I would say that the evidence, my learned experience, is actually precisely the opposite of that. So the case study. So, effectively, I've alluded to it a bit, but we have here two different examples. One person is saving with My 65 Plus. The other person is saving with the typical RSP. You see the math is pretty dramatic. This assumes, you see the assumptions at the bottom. They may be a bit difficult for people to read in the room, but it assumes actually the same rate of return. I would say that that's actually a very charitable assumption that we would be giving to people who would be investing through an RSP. And the reason I say that is that most people do not, when they invest on their own, get into proper asset allocation, and they make all kinds of crazy decisions. I say crazy, they're suboptimal decisions around what they invest in, and that doesn't typically lead to, say, a stable compounding of, the assumption here is about 5% a year. So the net result, effectively, of doing it in the way that we will be doing it is 300 to 400% more efficient than a typical RSP. Which we think is a pretty good innovation. So a few other things that I want to highlight around what we've done and how we approach this. Portability, in our view, is very important. Part of what we have in our system is we have a system that attaches to employers, and that is probably a system that for some of the reasons that even Sunil talked about, people don't really, first of all, they don't stay in jobs for as long as they used to. They move from job to job. Even people who are not in this category, typical tenure in a job might be 5 to 7 years. In this particular case, there's a fair amount of turnover in this sector, but true portability requires actually people to connect, in our view, through a bank account. If it's only connected effectively through an employer and it is not possible to move from employer to employer, the possibility actually of compounding something within a single vehicle is hugely diminished. And say an employer-centric system is not a system that in our view is sustainable. Even higher income people have effectively multiple, often stranded accounts. Sometimes when they leave a group-sponsored plan, the fees on those accounts will go up quite considerably. And so portability, we think, is a very important feature of the way we set up our arrangements. Members first, I talked about this a little bit before, but the fiduciary duty to put the members' interests first is actually, in our view, a very important duty. When you think about the financial services industry, and I don't mean to gang up on them unduly, but their fiduciary duty is to their shareholders. It is not to members. There's a big difference between the way, let's say, a public pension plan operates, which ultimately has a fiduciary duty to members, and the way our financial services products are provided. People don't understand that the duty is always to the shareholder from a financial services firm. It is never to the member, never to the customer. And we believe that in the way our arrangements should be set up, the duty should always be to the member. Which is why in everything that we set up, we set things up to be overseen by a not-for-profit board that is effectively, in this case, it's a combination of union representatives and also experts. Those people, in turn, hold the service providers to account to provide the best possible service to the members, which requires effectively ongoing, let's say, oversight of the service providers in exactly the same way, in some ways, that a public pension fund would do. So we believe that that's very important. This particular product is open to all of SEIU Healthcare's members and also their families. The last point is a point around simplicity. We believe in the way we approach things that complexity is actually in no way helpful. Part of, I'd say the way the financial services industry has sold products historically is that choice is actually of benefit. Choice is not, according to the evidence, of benefit. There is very little value in people having a buffet of options, in randomly selecting stocks. There is basically an erosion of value if people typically, I would say statistically, it is almost impossible to, through effectively, people randomly selecting things or even having a buffet of options, to outperform a market or to get a better result. So the way we approach things is that the investment product should be a simple product. I'm not saying that it should be a random product, but it should be effectively selected and overseen by experts. We also believe, obviously, that it's important for the contributions to be invested in a low-cost product. In this particular case, the cost of the investment product is about 10% of the cost of a typical mutual fund in Canada. And in this particular case, for this particular product, it will be invested in a low-cost target date fund. A target date fund is effectively an investment product that has a mix of equities and fixed income. The risk adjusts according to age. It's used as a default product for a lot of multinational pension arrangements, and we think it's a perfectly defensible and supportable product for this particular group to use. And it's provided in this case by Vanguard, which is certainly a very reputable investment firm. We also believe in simple self-serve online administration because the cost from an administrative perspective should always be as low as possible. So those are some of the features that I wanted to highlight. So Liz asked me to throw out a policy idea. So this is a policy idea. So the policy idea is effectively a policy idea, and there are probably some people here from the States that would have much more knowledge of this idea than I do, although I've talked to some of the folks who were involved in creating this in the U.S., who were at Treasury and continue to work on this at Brookings and ARP and a handful of other spots. But before I actually get to that policy idea, I want to talk a little bit about the current landscape for retirement security in Canada, which is that our incentives are regressive. So the RSP deduction in Canada the value is actually at the highest for those who are in the top tax brackets. There is no incentive in our current structure to contribute to a TFSA, even though when the Department of Finance created the TFSA, they suggested that would be a great vehicle for lower income Canadians to save in. The investing in an RSP results in that GIS clawback that you saw, which is obviously extremely inefficient, and the CPP enhancement, as I alluded to or talked about earlier, does pretty well nothing for modest and lower income earners. And so most retirement savings, in the incentives and the way they're structured right now, actually effectively go to our top tier, and you could say that is not necessarily shifting behavior. It may be shifting the efficiency of the tax, but it's not necessarily shifting the behavior. So the idea here, and it's not, I would say, fully formed, but would be to try and encourage effectively the federal government to think about a, call it, matching program for low and moderate income Canadians. And that match could be, call it $1,000 or $2,000 of something that could go into hopefully an efficient type plan. It could be refundable. Even if the workers are eligible, even if they're not effectively paying tax, it could be delivered through tax system or a retirement plan administrator, easy and well promoted. Part of it is, at the end of the day, as we've heard with a lot of programs like this, if these things are not well promoted and well distributed, they are not taken up. Part of this at the end of in terms of raising something like this is it is clear, and Liz, I think, referred to it a few minutes ago, that there is a very significant segment of our population which is not being well looked after by our system. And we have a system from an administrative perspective, from a regulatory perspective, that is not serving them. We have a financial services industry that is not really serving them. And so I throw that out there as something that people might consider. And so that, I'm getting a yellow warning, so I'm going to wrap it up. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. So that's it. It's powerful.
Okay, I'd like to open, thank you, Jonathan, that was wonderful. And Jonathan won't say this because he doesn't like to brag, but he's currently spearheading an initiative to actually build a similar retirement income plan for the entire voluntary sector in Canada for modest income workers. So, which is really badly needed. We have terrible retirement savings rates in our own sector. Busy helping others, but looking forward to a very skimpy retirement in our own organization. So thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you.
Questions?
Okay, David.
David.
Thanks for the presentation. So my question has to do with kind of how, I know that your product isn't necessarily geared towards combating income volatility, but is the structure of the retirement account that you've created liquid in any way? Is there any way for folks to get access to that money, or by design, you don't think that they should get access because you're trying to create long-term wealth as opposed to short-term liquidity?
I mean, it's an excellent question. I would say that in terms of regulatory categories, the use of the TFSA is probably the best regulatory category to use for that purpose, because if people take it out, they're not going to get dinged heavily for taking it out. Having said that, the issue, which is not at the end of the day fully resolved and will have to be monitored, is always a balance between, say, liquidity, because most of the people in this category would meet the technical definition of financial hardship, and encouragement for savings for retirement. And where that winds up, I really can't say right now. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're thinking about as you have, I think, kind of sidecar type things, the problem, in a sense, when you back up from this whole thing, is that it's very difficult to get people to save a very significant amount for retirement if they don't have anything. So, the issue of the desire and the capacity are not always, in sync in a particular moment in time. I mean, I think that the value of also partnering with a union on this is that they care very much about their members. They have the capacity to bargain benefits for their members, and so they have the capacity in all of that, in a sense, to help them, hopefully, to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. But I mean, it's an excellent question for which there is no simple answer. John.
Canadian government seems to be on an auto-enrollment kick these days with the Canada Workers Benefit. We got GST credits a couple of years ago, and I guess GIS last November as a type of auto-enrollment. I'm just wondering if for your proposal, would there be enough information in the tax system that actually, and let's say if you were to match, would it be enough there for the government to actually, through a tax algorithm, to actually pay the money in without having the tax filer to enroll?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and what I don't know, I mean, part of it, if we're being realistic about this, is that governments, I think, often depend in terms of their costing on not 100% take-up rates. So there could be a desire. I mean, if we were actually wanting to achieve exactly what we're talking about achieving, the costing for that would be a multiple. So my instinct is that a government, or I mean, if we're talking about our federal government, would be unlikely to say, even if they could, that we're effectively depositing X amount of dollars into everyone's account who qualifies in this particular way, largely for that reason. I mean, if we're, I think, being realistic about it. Bless you. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. sort of StatCan, data geeky kind of comment. The diagnostic that you presented at the beginning showing the low income cutoff, actually the situation could be a lot worse than what that line shows.
Well, that's truly depressing.
The low income cutoff is a low income threshold. It's an anchored line that's based upon 1992 standards of living.
Okay.
And it's only been updated for changes in prices since then.
Okay.
So, so what that means is that a senior that's lying below and we know that since 1992, the median standard of living for Canadians has increased tremendously. We saw that in a number of presentations today that showed the median income of Canadians rising strongly over the last 15 years. So what that means is that a senior that's sitting below the LICO in the early 1990s had a much higher relative standard of living than a senior sitting below the LICO in 2017. So in relative terms, a senior below the LICO in 2017 is much worse off than a senior below the LICO was 20 years ago. So what you could do to be more impressive in terms of how bad off seniors are is use a relative low income measure, the low income measure, as a contrast point. The low income measure shows how far seniors have fallen behind the median Canadian. And for seniors, the low income measure has been climbing for the last 20 years.
Right, that makes sense, yeah. But that is depressing.
It might be paralyzing it if we show people that.
So how bad, I mean, do you think it actually is?
So, I'm only sort of just making a comment on the indicator itself and the story that it tells. The story that's told by LICO is how Canadians are doing relative to a living standard that was established quite a long time ago, and hasn't been updated in a very long time. Right. So, I think in some ways it's a misleading story. I think seniors who walk into your office or you're consulting with probably see themselves as falling farther and farther behind the median Canadian, because they live in Canadian society like everybody else does, and they see the things that other people are able to do, like younger people than them as well, and probably some older people as well, especially lower income seniors, are probably looking around themselves and saying, like, this is maybe where this sort of notion that the government transfers that I get, they aren't enough. Well, according to LICO, it's enough to get you over the LICO, so you should be satisfied. Right. But the fact is that it's not being indexed in such a way that maintains a senior standard of living at relative to what Canadians expect in terms of the median. Right. So, so that's the way I would interpret that kind of contrast in statistics, is that if for seniors who are living on a fixed OAS GIS bundle, which is only updated for CPI, and in an environment where incomes are rising faster than prices do, seniors are falling behind. Right.
Yeah. All the more reasons people should do something about it. Yeah. Okay. Call it a day. Thank you. Okay.